Now, for a further look at the security situation in Iraq, the conference in Paris, we turn to Manal Omar. She's an associate vice president at the United States Institute for Peace. Manal, thanks for being on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Let me begin with this conference in Paris. 24 countries pledged to do what they can to fight ISIS. In fact, the quote I heard was, "by any means necessary." What does that mean exactly, and will each specific country have a specific role? It doesn't seem like that's all that clear.
I think that that's something that they are trying to meet to actually determine. I think there are two things. One is exactly as you said, what does by all means necessary mean? And once you begin to divide out those responsibilities or define what each country can do, will the coalition actually stay together? I think the most important recognition is that whatever happens to defeat ISIS can't only be something targeting one group. There's an ideology that is expanded, and that's the real threat. And so it needs real political solutions, not only military intervention.
So how do you think Iraq's new government sees this conference? Are they satisfied by what they saw, number one? And number two, is this a country that can now be better equipped to deal with the IS threat?
I think that there are two issues. One, for a long time, Iraq was falling off of the international radar. So the fact that Iraq is now back at the center of the international community, I'm sure is something that is restoring confidence within the Iraqi people, but also the Iraqi government. So at the very least, in that sense, I think Iraq and the government is very pleased to see that people are taking the threat seriously and recognizing, going to your second question, that Iraq cannot handle this alone. I don't think it's merely a train and equip mode that we have to go into Iraq. It really is international intervention and support, because what we're seeing with the Islamic State is beyond one country. The Syria-Iraq conflict have merged, and even into the region, you have a lot of the neighboring states that are very fragile. So I don't think it's any one country, even if Iraq was to say at its strongest, would be able to really respond to the threat that's emerged.
Do you think the fight against IS can be successful, it can be mission accomplished without the presence of some type of boots on the ground, the term we've heard over and over?
I think that you're going to need some type of, again, political solution over military solution. My concern is that the focus on military solution may actually lead to a new mutation, and that's what we see Islamic State as. It's a mutation of several other extremist groups. I think that you already have boots on the ground. 1,500 U.S. troops are there. It may not be...
But not in combat role.
But as I say, it may not be in a combat role. That's a very important distinction. But even as advising, even with the strikes, there eventually comes a question, what happens if none of this works? My sense is that it'll be very difficult to depend solely on the Iraqi army. Again, this is beyond train and equip. At the same time, the real question will be, can you find the political solutions? Can you have a true unity, inclusive government within Iraq that we're beginning to see elements of, but again, will it stand the difficult conversations that Iraq has always not managed to handle? And more importantly, we do need to look at the political solution for Syria. If those issues are not resolved in the short term, then I can't see anything more than increased intervention to try and handle the threat.
So what do you make of Iran not being at this conference? Iran is a key player. And of course, the Iranians say, even if we had been invited, we wouldn't want to be there to begin with, and all this tough rhetoric going on back and forth. Should Iran be at this conference?
Well, I think whether Iran's at the conference or not, whether it's direct or indirect, Iran, as you pointed out, is a regional player and very interested in a solution to the Islamic threat. I think that's where we find common ground, both as the U.S. and international community. I think it's not a matter of if we bring in Iran, it really is a matter of when and how. My assumption would be that there must be offline conversations taking place. There may not be bilateral conversations with the U.S. and Iran, but Iran has significant influence in Iraq. It has significant allies in the region. And so even if they're not doing it directly through the U.S., it's more likely that they're doing it with their regional counterparts. I personally believe that there is no way to really address the changing dynamics of vacuums of power in the region without having a conversation across the globe, including Iran, including Turkey, and addressing some difficult conversations with the Gulf as well.
And you mentioned, when we were speaking earlier, you mentioned a political solution. What is the political solution here?
Well, I think first and foremost, starting where we have the most influence is Iraq, and really making sure that the new prime minister, the new president, fulfill their obligation of an inclusive government. That means bringing in the Sunnis and the Kurds to a larger extent, and more specifically supporting the Sunnis in a leadership that has legitimacy on the ground with the tribes, with the people. I think that's one of the best ways to counter the Islamic State. The second issue is that we do have to find some resolution and perhaps a stronger position when it comes to Syria. To pretend that Syria is a footnote in this, I think is something that we'll maybe get away with in the short term, but as we've seen, ignoring Syria tends to have very dramatic long-term consequences. So the hope is that there'll be a more firm status on what our position is in Syria, whether it's a protected territory for the opposition or finally admitting that Assad must go.
But when you're dealing with a terror group like IS, their tactics are clearly brutal, savage. Is there any way to reach a political solution without really including some kind of negotiation with this terror group?
I don't think that you can negotiate with a group like IS. I think that they're, it's not just the tools that they use that's cruel and that's barbaric. It's actually their brand. Their entire brand is to try and alienate and isolate and create the myth of the clash of civilization. So it's very hard to negotiate with them. But the fact of the matter is that they are not a centralized organization. They're decentralized. Al-Baghdadi initiated Jabhat al-Nusra, which was in Syria, and then moved over and created a new extreme group. Again, it's mutations and spin-offs. I think that what we need to do is get to the lower level, to the groups that they're trying to target to add on, the militias that may have been created out of goodwill to protect neighborhoods, the tribes. I think if you go down to the second and third level and really are able to attract those groups, then you would be able to significantly win the recruitment ground of ISIS.
Very good point. All right, Manal Omar, thank you so much for your take.
Thank you for having me.